Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on what time zone you're in right now and when you're listening to us. And welcome along to this, the pilot episode or preview episode of COP28 Covered, the brand new daily podcast show brought to you from the UK's largest and longest running sustainable business media brand, that is Edie. It is Monday the 27th of November. You're listening to the voice of Edie's publisher, Luke Nichols. And I'm sure many of you listening will be familiar with the sustainable business media brand that is Edie, maybe even with my voice, because you will otherwise often hear me on the hugely popular Sustainability Uncovered podcast, which sees us deliver up monthly episodes rounding up the biggest stories from across the world of corporate climate action with a host of special guests. And as the name of this new limited spin-off series suggests, COP28 Covered sees us take the show on the road, because we're going to be very soon heading out to the UN's COP28 Climate Summit over in Dubai in the UAE, just as we did for the COP26 Covered show back in Glasgow in 2021, a show that ended up charting on the likes of iTunes and Spotify, other platforms available. But hopefully we can reach those dizzy heights once again. And I'm pleased and slightly relieved, I must say, that it won't just be me heading out there and doing it all on my own, because I will once again be joined by a couple of Edie's trusty editorial team who are connected with me virtually for this preview episode of the show. Now, I've gone through my long list of comparable famous double acts, and today I think I'll go with the Woody and Buzz of sustainable business. That is Edie's content editor, Matt Mace, and deputy editor, Sarah George. Matt, hello, how are you doing? And which one are you, Woody or Buzz?
I think I'm a Buzz, like kind of detached from reality a lot of the time, like Buzz was, believing he was an actual was he a spaceman, wasn't he? So probably more Buzz. But yeah, I'm good. Very, very busy in the climate space right now, not just in COP preparations, but just in terms of the amount of news and policy stuff we're getting pushed through at the moment. So busy, but good.
Is that a hangover I can hear in your voice, or a cold?
Let's just go with both.
Okay, lots of follow-up questions, but I won't ask them now. And Sarah, speaking of buzz, are you buzzing and raring to go for this COP?
I mean, as Matt says, it is a very busy time of year, but I think that whenever I've had a coffee in the morning, then yes, I am ready and raring to go. If for nothing else, to get some sun after the winter that has really gripped the UK. The 3:30 p.m. pitch black is getting to me. Obviously, I'm saying this in a light-hearted way. Going to COP and getting to cover it is a privilege. I was thinking, that we talk about COP and we talk so much jargon, and I feel like obviously the vast majority of people won't get a chance to go. So yeah, I'm a bit, in that sort of mood, in a sort of this is a privilege sort of mood at the moment.
Mixture of moods among us then. Great stuff. So that's the three of us. Let's crack on with this then, this first teaser episode of the COP28 Covered podcast. Okay, yes. Hello, everyone from a freezing cold home here in West Sussex. I'm very much looking forward to that temperature change, as Sarah's just mentioned. Because, as we say, this show is all around COP28, the 28th Conference of the Parties in its long form, which will see world leaders, negotiators, business leaders, activists, and figures, including the likes of King Charles and Pope Francis, descending on Dubai for 2 weeks of climate talks. Hopefully some commitments and genuine progress as a result of it all. Over 70,000 people are expected to be attending this one, making it in fact the largest ever United Nations climate change summit. And we're going to be out there on the ground reporting from the heart of the action with daily roundups, exclusive interviews, listener quizzes, and so much more right here every day on COP28 Covered. Now, we're not on the ground just yet because myself, Matt and Sarah are all connected up remotely and in final preparation mode as we head out to the UAE on Wednesday, the 29th. You should probably know that now. It's only in a couple of days' time, with day one of COP then officially kicking off on the Thursday. Matt, you WhatsApped me just before we came on air asking if the Airbnb has a hairdryer. I assume you haven't packed yet then?
I'm like half packed. I was more intrigued about the ironing board situation. I've kind of I've got the suitcase out of the attic, made sure it fits the right size and weight. But yeah, I'm half packed. I do need to probably buy a few more like shirts. I think essentially, I mean, how many days are we going to be in the expo for? I think I don't quite have enough, and because it's 29 degrees out there, I don't really want to have to wear the same shirt back to back. I don't think hygienically that's the best idea. So
No, given that we're staying in the same vicinity as you, I'd very much appreciate if you did that. Yeah. I suppose I should explain that actually. Then, yeah, if nothing else, this trip out to Dubai will be a bit of a kind of team bonding exercise because Matt, Sarah, and I are going to be sharing an apartment out in Dubai for the best part of 2 weeks. And much like the last time we did this back for COP26 Covered in Glasgow, responsibility for booking the apartment fell very much to me. Sarah, for those listeners who didn't tune into that COP26 show back in 2021, how would you describe that shared experience?
I mean, what can I say, Luke? They say keep your friends close, but your enemies closer. And maybe the best place to keep them is in a student flat in Glasgow. So as people who are familiar with the COP process might be aware, travel and accommodation costs really do go up for these. So finding an apartment is possibly the best route for those on a budget. Honestly, everything was gone, even though we booked really far in advance, wasn't it, Luke? It was
Yeah, it was
not a huge amount of choice. We ended up staying in a student flat, which was very studenty. I believe there was something inflatable hung up in the wall in the kitchen. I think it might have been a banana.
Yeah, banana. It was a banana. I remember it now. You mentioned it.
Just
to ease the listeners' minds, there it was a banana, but not inflatable banana. Yeah.
Yeah. So it was a case of wake up, eat your porridge under the inflatable banana, and then walk over to the conference, go through airport style security, and then you're off for the day, really.
Yeah, hopefully Dubai is going to be a bit less studency, less cramped, a bit more glamorous, probably inflatable flamingos more likely than inflatable bananas. Or maybe again we'll be duped by some very tactical and photoshopped photos that make it look a lot better than it is. We shall see. Anyway, so like I said, this episode of COP28 Covered will be a bit different and a bit shorter than the rest of the series because we don't actually have any guests joining us for the first episode. It's just us. Practically hear the listeners dropping off like flies at this point, but I promise this is going to be worth a listen because for this preview episode I want to have a bit of a chat about exactly what's going to be going on over the next couple of weeks to help those listeners out who just want to get their head around the COP28 process and get a feel for which themes of this summit are most important to you and your work or life. And in true edie podcast fashion, I thought we could start with a game of sorts, I think, because you guys know I love a game and I love a climate pun. So where better to start than with a game of good cop, bad cop. Now, Matt, we're not about to shine a spotlight in your face and interrogate you about what happened to cause that hangover of yours. But instead, I would like each of you, Matt and Sarah, to tell us what you think would make a good COP28 and what would make a bad COP28. So where are those pivotal areas that you think will make this summit either a success or a non-success from a corporate sustainability perspective? Sarah, going to start with you. Good cop, bad cop, where do you want to start?
I mean, I'll start with the bad cop because I think the thing that's weighing on everyone's minds is the fact that this is the second COP to be held in an oil and gas exporting nation. And there's been a lot said about the extent to which the state-owned oil and gas company out in Dubai is going to be involved in this, given that the president is its CEO. So for me, a bad COP would be one that really doesn't recognise the urgency of the energy transition. This is something we saw last year as well. A lot of countries were saying, like, we'd love to go all in renewables and nuclear, but what about energy security and what about Russia's war in Ukraine, and let's build some more LNG terminals. So my bad cop would be a continuation of that, especially as the UN and the UN itself has said that we're on track to breach the Paris Agreement and reach 2.9C by 2100, largely because of failures to properly plan for the energy transition. So that for me would be the bad cop. The good cop would be on the other side of this, if the global stocktake that's taking place really does whet people's appetites to rally around an increased call for action. And also if a lot of the stuff we saw from Egypt last year gets actually operationalised and going, because there were some really interesting things, admirable things launched by the presidency there in terms of adaptation and loss and damage. So just actually seeing some of that come to action rather than talk would be good cop.
Matt, over to you.
Yeah, I think it's fairly similar for me. I think the language and the final document or whatever's agreed is going to be probably what will hinge as to whether it's a bad cop around that kind of fossil fuel mentions. We obviously saw in Glasgow, and then the kind of last minute pushbacks from some nations and the weakening down of languages from phase out to phase down, which can have very different meanings and do have very different meanings. So I think that's going to be the backup is just the kind of fossil fuel in the room, so to speak. And you obviously need to have these people involved. You can't transition to net zero without the major energy companies being part of it. But if they're just going to kind of push back on it, then ultimately it just slows the whole thing down. I think good COP will largely depend on the global stock take as well. Obviously, this big 5-year assessment of essentially where we're at in terms of hitting these NDCs. I think it's going to be a bit of a bleak assessment, but I think what it can do is actually it just will hold a mirror up to the people in the room. The fact that this is being announced at COP means everyone's going to be talking about it. We're going to see how off track people are with their NDCs, that these NDCs aren't even probably ambitious enough anymore, and hopefully it's kind of energizes and kind of moves the conversations on for a slightly more ambitious target setting and implementation aspect.
Okay, yeah. Well, it's probably no surprise to say that our bad COPs are pretty much all aligned across the board, because I think I would have said something similar. It really is something that can't be ignored, that COP28 President Dr. Sultan Al Jaber, Chief Executive of the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, as most people listening I'm sure will know. It's that company that recently announced plans to add 7.6 billion barrels of oil to its production in the coming years, representing the 5th largest increase in the world. And I think even at a broader national level, the UAE pledged back in 2015 to generate 24% of its electricity by clean sources in 2021. We then saw the stories coming out earlier this year, which revealed it had only reached 11% by that point, which is really not a good look for a host nation. For context, the UK is on about 42% renewable energy generation. And as I say, I think that is my bad cop in a way, not just those points in general, but because that's obviously not good, but really a bad summit here will be not addressing that fossil fuel in the room, as Matt said, and not addressing that head on, and ministers instead choosing to focus on other more comfortable issues, should we say, or progress points. I'm not expecting the COP president to stand up and pledge to immediately scrap fossil fuels, but at the very least should be there to influence the shift away from oil and gas. It's worth noting that Dr. Sultan also set up the Masdar Renewables company, so in a sense he has those two pathways in his hands. So that's the potential backup. I think for me, good COP, I'll go with something a bit different and point towards 8th of December. I'm struggling to know what days are what, but I think that's the Friday. This is the day that is dedicated to youth, children, education and skills. I think we'll be going through the full schedule in a moment, but for me, that youth element of the day is, and of COP in general, is really important, because a good COP for me will be one where that youth voice isn't sidelined, it isn't just kept to a single day, but in fact hoping for some good youth representation at various events throughout the summer. And if we could come away from this COP with a greater sense of younger generations actually having a valid and critical role to play in the conversation, then I think that in itself would be a success.
Is that also because the 8th we're leaving on the 7th, so you don't have to like share accommodation with us anymore? That's why you're looking for that.
Very much so, yeah. I'm kind of straight away going to be taking the best room wherever that's gone after you guys have gone. And yeah, a good COP as well, looking ahead on that point, actually will be one that has more than one mirror and a working iron. Because at the end of those 2 weeks out there, last time around in Glasgow, we ended up looking like we'd spent a fortnight in Glastonbury. Maybe I'm just speaking of myself there. Anyway, so that's our good cops, bad cops out of the way. I think it's about time for another segment, which brings us a bit more up to speed with the latest developments actually surrounding this COP. So what is the climate action landscape actually looking like in the final run up to the summit? And to do this, I'm going to turn to you, Sarah, and your dedicated editorial series, which I know gets a lot of hits on the site, the COP28 Action Tracker. Tell us a bit about what you've been doing with the series and how you're going to bring it to life for us here.
Yeah, sure. So the COP28 Action Tracker sort of does what it says on the tin. It's a weekly or bi-weekly written feature that provides a regular temperature check on climate action here in the UK, where edie's based, globally, including what the COP presidency is up to, and then from the non-state actors as well. So for those of you a little unfamiliar with COPs, non-state actor is a term used by the UN to refer to anyone that isn't a national government. So maybe a city or an NGO or a business. So specifically tracking what's going on in the private sector. So we've been running this tracker since early October, I think, and yeah, we may have already had the last edition depending on my availability around packing.
Okay, and do you want a custom-made jingle for this segment as I hand over to you?
Absolutely.
Of course you do. The COP28 Action Tracker.
I didn't know it would be improv, but I guess copyright. So just to recap on some of the headlines from the last COP Action Tracker. Just before we are heading out, the UN has published its annual emissions gap report, looking at the gap between current and likely future emissions and the level of those needed to deliver the Paris Agreement, the famous agreement that was struck at COP21. The report essentially found that we're on track for 2.9 degrees of warming by 2100 based on existing national pledges to the Paris Agreement. This could be cut to 2.5 if pledges that are dependent on other factors come to being, other factors usually being the provision of funding to developing and emerging economies. But even so, that wouldn't be enough to deliver the Paris Agreement, which of course has a 1.5 degree overarching aim. So that was the big news on the global stage, to be honest, and that is quite a bleak picture to be going in with, but also I think the UN does want to give everyone a little shove at this point. There has also been a number of interesting moves coming out in terms of national policy as well. So within the past week here in the UK, we've had the autumn statement where the Chancellor was expected to provide a rival to the US Inflation Reduction Act. There was a $4.5 billion promise for cleaner manufacturing, but this is nowhere near the scale or scope of the Inflation Reduction Act. Elsewhere, all eyes are on the two biggest emitters at present, China and the US, which have actually issued a renewed statement of intent to collaborate on climate cooperation. This is called the Sunnyland Statement, if you wanted to look it up. Fairly vague language, as is typical of these things, but they have backed a global goal of tripling renewable energy generation this decade. So worth having a look at that. That should be super important. And the other big global piece of news was about the $100 billion of international climate finance that rich nations promised to give annually to emerging and developing economies in 2009, and which has gone unmet every year since. The OECD released data in the past fortnight stating that that goal was likely met in 2022. So we can expect a lot of debates on whether it was actually met, whether a new goal should be set, and what can be done about the historic shortfall. So the full edition of this action tracker is on our site. If you just search edie COP28 Action Tracker, you'll be able to find it if you are an edie member. So do have a look and dive into all of the stories I've mentioned in more detail there, plus a lot more.
Great stuff. Yeah, worth mentioning that it's only available to ED members, and I won't do a shameless plug for membership, but just Google ED28, ED COP28 Action Tracker, and you'll go through to one of the articles, and that will display information on how you can get full access to those and more. Right, this opening episode of the show has been far too highbrow for an ED podcast, so Matt, I'm going to now turn to you to duly bring us back down to earth. As listeners of our COP26 Covered podcast back in 2021 might remember, in our preview episode, Matt gave us some of his recommendations of places to visit while we were out there in Glasgow. Only one I can remember was you mentioning the world's largest nightclub, as you called it, which then you said was the Europe's largest nightclub, which then I went away and Googled, and it was Scotland's largest nightclub. We didn't go, needless to say, we're far too busy for that, but thought we could turn again to you, Matt, our resident tour guide, to give us some tasters for what we can expect out in Dubai.
Yeah, I'm glad my skill set of lowering the bar and bringing us out of highbrow conversations can be utilised again. So, I mean, my tour guide skills are very limited. I've been around Europe quite a bit, but generally this is only the second time I'll be travelling out of the continent ever. So I'm excited in that sense. So in terms of just what I've seen. I think how I define this is what is free to do in Dubai, because we are journalists. It's almost Christmas. Got a Christmas shopping to do when I get back. But there are some really nice things. I mean, most important for me is just to get a tan. I wanna kind of be wearing my my red Christmas jumper and having a burnt skin that matches, essentially. So obviously beaches and whatnot are great, and very, very close to where we're staying, which is good. But there are some interesting things, like kind of just on the outskirts of Dubai. There's the Ras Al Khor Wildlife Sanctuary, which it's essentially this kind of sprawling wetlands of various lakes and stuff. There's more than 60 types of bird species, flamingos, and whatnot as well. There's some really cool photos with like the city as the backdrop and just these kind of flamingos chilling out there. And as far as I'm aware, it's free to visit. So if I get the chance, I'll certainly be doing that. There's various kind of lakes and just outdoor areas. I think even though Dubai is a very modern city, what's going to be cool for me is to actually kind of see nature out there. I'm much more of a escape to the country type of guy than anything else. And one thing that I just thought was really interesting was apparently there's camel racing out there quite a bit. I don't know if it's got the same. Camels. Yeah, I don't know if it's got the same amount of kind of controversies as horse racing does, but provided it is kind of ethically set up, then yeah, watch some camel races. I can't imagine it being too quick, but a race is a race.
Thank you very much for that. Yeah, Matt lives near a camel as well, I should mention, and somehow that came up the other week. Well, thanks for that, Matt. I could hardly take it seriously considering I didn't want to mention this on air, but yeah, he's wearing a woolly hat and jumpered right up to the neck. So
I'm cosplaying as like the average podcaster, like guy who sets up a podcast in his living room is basically me right now. I have a woolly hat, some glasses, and a fuzzy jumper.
Yeah, you've nailed that one. Right, so we've got our hopes and expectations out there for the summit. Sarah's given us her highbrow action tracker. Matt's chimed in with his lowbrow tourism tips. We've got a listener quiz to close off the show, but before that, I guess it'd be good to just briefly turn to the actual COP schedule, because if you're anything like me, you broadly know what COP's about, and you might have some ideas about the big topics and decision points, but you're probably not too familiar with the day-to-day schedule and the sessions that are going on, especially those that sit outside of that central blue zone, which has the main negotiations in it. But I think the green zone, which houses most of the business discussions and sideline events, could actually end up being more important than ever this year. So as with previous COPs, most of the days are themed with things like energy, finance, nature, and so on. We'll include a link to the full day-to-day programme in the article alongside this episode. But for now, I thought we could have a quick rundown of our standout days or sessions that we're most looking forward to. Sarah, let's start again with you. Any days or particular events or sessions that you're particularly looking forward to?
Not as specific as sessions or events, but I think I'd be remiss not to mention the fact that the first full 2 days of any COP are the World Leaders Summit. So this is a time for representatives of every country present to set out their negotiating positions, each given a very brief speech to do this. There are also always some surprise guests and keynote speeches. So in at COP26, in 2021, vividly remember Barack Obama just materialising and all the press, running to try and capture a photo of former president. So this is something with so much buzz that really helps to set the scene for the coming weeks. So I'd be remiss not to mention that. And this year, the presidency is running this alongside a business and philanthropy forum. So while the world leaders are doing their thing in one part of the summit, we'll have an equally big gathering of CEOs, chief financial officers, other business decision makers, and big philanthropists elsewhere, expecting Bloomberg to be there specifically. So yeah, I'd have to go for those first couple of days. And then directly after those, we're having the first themed day on health, which is super noteworthy. Really looking forward to seeing what happens and whether that has any sway on public health getting more of a mention in the official negotiating text outcomes.
Yeah, very interesting. Okay, so Matt, over to you. Any standout sessions days?
Yeah, I mean, sessions itself is quite hard because I've downloaded the app, but anything on the actual physical agenda in terms of what happens on each day just says coming soon, which felt like a very COP Very COP thing to do. It's very last minute in terms of getting all the information. But I think in terms of what I'm really interested to see is December 5th, which is the Energy Transition Day, but kind of bridged in with that is the just transition and indigenous peoples as the overarching theme. I think we saw certainly in Egypt, the kind of COP that took place in the global south, how important it is to have that voice in it, because those were the people on the front line in terms of responding to the worst impacts of the climate crisis. But right now, we're in a very privileged position, Europe-based, where we're still seeing those effects, but nowhere near as severe. So I think having these kind of indigenous peoples whose livelihoods and whatnot are just completely at stake is kind of important. And I think combining that with the energy transition, considering how much of a focus that's going to be, is something I'm interested to see how it goes. Might not be my favourite day, but I certainly think it'll be the most interesting one.
Yeah, and probably the most busy for all of us. For me, I like the look of, Sarah mentioned it, but the December 3rd, which I think is the Sunday, it's that health, relief, recovery and peace day. Each of those topics are so broad and it will be impossible to properly do them justice, especially the recovery and peace elements. I'm going to be interested in how they kind of cover that, given the current geopolitical situations we're seeing across the world right now. Actually, I think that health element that Sarah says is a really interesting one. It's the first time I think we've had a health day at COP, and that interconnection between health and the climate crisis, if it's given enough kind of credence, is arguably the most important of them all right now, because we know the climate crisis is putting greater pressure on our already stretched health systems and jeopardizing the provision of basic healthcare. But there's kind of a paradox there as well in the healthcare sector, in that it's contributing to the problem. It's responsible for approximately 5% of global emissions. So looking forward to hearing about what's happening right now in that space, and hopefully we can make it the focus of our podcast episode, which goes out on that day. And I think that brings this preview episode of COP28 Covered almost to a close, because I promised a daily listener quiz at the beginning of the show. The regular listeners among you will know that our listener quiz commitments are about as sturdy as the UK government's 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution. But I think we should at least try and stay true to our word for episode 1. And also, I thought this would be quite a good way of gauging the level of engagement with this show from the offset, because we're going to ask listeners to email in the answers to this question. So this will go one of two ways. Either the emails will come pouring in and we'll know we're on to a winner with the series, or we'll get no emails at all and realise that this is basically just the three of us on a Teams call talking into an echo chamber. So if you're listening, please let us know for our sanity that you're out there. I'll give you that email address in a second. But Sarah, I'm going to hand over to you as our usual quiz host. Have you got a COP-themed quiz question for our listeners for the day?
Yeah, that's right. For regular Sustainability Uncovered listeners, you'll know that I revel in being quizmaster, and I'm normally putting Matt and Luke to the test against each other. But for now, it's an audience quiz time, and our question for this first episode is: COP29 doesn't have an official host yet, but where has been selected to host COP30 in 2025?
Where has been selected to host COP30 in 2025? So like I say, the first correct answer that comes in over email wins. What do they win, Sarah? Something to maybe just a special shout out in the next episode of the show at the very least. And the email address then to send your answer to is podcast@fav, that's FAV house.com, podcast@fav-house.com. And I think that's a wrap for this episode of COP28 Covered. It's gone rather well, if I do say so myself, although Matt's dog is now slowly taken over his living room and taken over the screen. Hopefully this has whet your appetite for what's to come, because the next time you hear from myself, Matt and Sarah, we will be fresh off a 7-hour flight on the ground in Dubai, reporting on the opening day of COP28, along with a couple of special guests. Now, if you are attending COP yourself and you'd like to meet the edie team, or you're not attending and you have some recommendations for our daily episodes or suggested interviews, or just want to say hello, then do reach out. You can email us on that same address at podcast@fav-house.com. The last thing I'll say before I get drowned out by this music is to make sure you are subscribed to this podcast. We will be publishing a new episode every day of the Climate Summit, starting on Wednesday. You can subscribe to COP28 Covered wherever you get your podcasts, and you can view the full list of episodes along with the editorial articles which have links to our daily COP coverage by going to edie.net/COP28. Okay, Until next time, it's a goodbye from Matt and his dog.
Goodbye.
Goodbye from Sarah.
Goodbye.
And it's a goodbye from me. Goodbye.